Hello and welcome to Forgotten Temples with myself, Mr. B. Now what is behind me here are the mountains at the An Long Veng. Now I've been here before. Last time was to shoot a video of Pol Pot's secret bunker, the last refuge for this mass murderer. Now that video got rather a good response, so I have returned. But this time in this video I am focusing on Pol Pot himself because he was an amazing character. And what is even more amazing is I have found an interview with Pol Pot where he explains as to what went wrong and as to what he feels about it. And that interview is well worth sticking around for. It will shock you. But we open up with a video of people marching off to what is a very uncertain future.
These people are being forced to praise and celebrate the life of one of the most evil men the world has ever seen. The saddest fact about this film is nearly everyone in it died a horrible, painful death. And the leader of that murderous gang was Pol Pot. The Khmer Rouge regime was highly autocratic, totalitarian, xenophobic, paranoid and repressive. The Khmer Rouge murdered hundreds of thousands of perceived political opponents, and its racist emphasis on national purity resulted in the genocide of many of Cambodia's minorities. The Cambodian genocide led to the deaths of approximately 2 million people, which is around 25% of the Cambodian population. But that Pol Pot guy never went away. He brought up a family, and he even gave interviews long into his old age. But who was he, and how did he get away? This is an extremely rare Khmer Rouge propaganda film. We see well-nourished, healthy, happy people. They're clapping and cheering on the agricultural revolution, one that would bring them an abundance of food. And that is because everything is working perfectly. In reality, the problem was the whole idea itself, because these tractors now had nobody to service them. The machinery that drove the farm and its production was now crippled, because if you were a mechanic and you'd received an education, or potentially could just read alone, then you were selected, you were picked out, and you were killed. This left the entire agricultural system in a state of chaos. And it was not through a want of trying. The capital city was evacuated, and every single inch of arable land was cultivated for the rice harvest. The land was besieged by a literal army. So how did it fail? I mean, you have all this fertile land and all this free labour. Well, the system itself was rotten to the core. If there was a parcel of land that, let's say, produced 20 tons of rice, it would be society. The truth was that it could not produce 50 tons of land. It was a physical impossibility. But were discovered, and it was seen that the land wasn't producing as it should be. Then, of course, you need to blame someone. You could never blame the system itself or even doubt it, because that is perfect. So the people that had to pay for the failure of this corrupt system were these very workers. They were tortured, maimed and killed for a system that could never ever work. This is S21, a former school in the capital of Phnom Penh. I have been there and I have cried there. These small dingy cells are where innocent people curled up and died horrific deaths. They all came from the fields, and each and every one of them was innocent, for there was no conspiracy. Even children were taken in, tortured and slaughtered. To understand Pol Pot, you have to understand S21, a former school that was turned into a literal hell. Because it is here we see very clearly exactly what Pol Pot was up to and how him and his Khmer Rouge went about their murderous business. Your journey to S21 would begin with you being grabbed from the fields. It would be perceived you had committed some crime against the state. It could be stealing a single grain of rice. You then would be shackled, often by the neck, and taken off into a camp. There you would be interrogated, asked your details, and have your photograph taken, being thrown into a cell that was quite simply appalling. But the horror hadn't really begun, because the torture that awaited you was horrific. And the single aim was to get you to confess. And of course, to give up names of others that were in the crime with you. For obviously it couldn't be just you that was against the state. And through your pain, you would scream and shout out names of others. And in turn, they would be brought in. What the Khmer Rouge created was quite simply a carousel of death.
Or we could say a carnival of carnage. Now this place is very interesting. This is the house of Tamuk. Now he was the number 2 of the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot's house is literally along the ridge there, just that way. I've covered Pol Pot's house in another video. The link's below if you'd like to see it. And they were neighbours. So just imagine for a moment, Pol Pot walked down the path which is just behind you. He came here and he knocked on this very door. And he would have sat here with his number 2 and discussed what was happening down there at the bottom of the mountain and throughout the whole of Cambodia. So where better for us to take a seat and to look at the history of Pol Pot and what made this tyrant, this mass murderer, this lunatic, than sit here exactly where he sat with his number 2 and came up with these diabolical plans. Now I compare Pol Pot to other dictators like Idi Amin and Gaddafi, and he is radically different. I mean, just think of those two. They were buffoons. What they would do is parade around with all their medals and their gold braid and their military bands. And they were quite simply preposterous. Pol Pot was completely and utterly different. He'd changed his name, and in doing so, he'd gained anonymity. His brother and sister are on the record as saying, we didn't know that he was brother number 1, you know, the Pol Pot. The way that we found out is we walked into a communal dining hall, and up on the wall was a poster of our brother, and they were shocked. Pol Pot's early start was at the age of 6, where he was sent off as a monk. And he was packed to Saigon. And what he says about that experience is extremely telling. What he says is, I felt like a dark monkey amongst all these sophisticated people. And that really is kind of how he acted whilst he was the leader of this craziness. He was very obscure. He never looked very comfortable on the camera. But it wasn't until he went to Paris for a further education that the germ was sown, because it was there that he bumped in with communists and he started to develop his own brand of communism. But returning to Cambodia, not many people were listening. He was hiding out in the jungle with a few chums that wanted to be rebels. Well, it wasn't until Richard Nixon handed him the greatest opportunity he could have wanted, because Nixon decided to start bombing the holy crap out of Cambodia. Now just think of this as a fact. The Americans dropped more bombs on Cambodia in their very brief spell than they did on Europe throughout the whole of the Second World War. It was a staggering amount of ordnance. And by doing so, he gave Pol Pot the step up he needed, because then him and his chums could go marching around saying, look, come join us, you know, we could all be equal, etc., etc. And that's not really a hard sell, is it, when you've got death raining from the skies? What I find particularly interesting about Pol Pot's brand of communism, it's the simplicity of it. He just took the bare bones. He took the 15-minute lesson and went, yeah, I know what I'm doing now, and just walked off. Because his whole thing was to create this utopia. We have to completely eradicate the past. I mean, that is just mental on its own, isn't it? And here's a list of some of the things, just some of the things that he banned. One of them, no families, no sentiment, no medicine, no learning, no holidays, no music, no schools, no hospitals. There was even no money. You see, the old ways had to completely and utterly be scrubbed from the history books. And they did it. They did the old Hitler style. They started burning the books, getting rid of any religious icons, anything at all that was associated with the past. He believed that the people that lived in the cities, the capital city like Phnom Penh, which they took, were tainted. And they were the ones that would potentially corrupt his ideal. And this is why he had a genocide against anyone that's educated. People who spoke a second language, killed. People who wore reading glasses were killed because they were considered intellectuals. And that was a bad thing, because you were probably thinking differently. But it wasn't those that received the most of his murderous intentions, because he was a complete and utter racist. Over 50% of the Chinese and the Muslims in Cambodia was slaughtered. Anyone that was married to a Vietnamese was also slaughtered. And the Vietnamese got it harder than anyone else, I think, because on record, there is not one single Vietnamese person that survived. So Pol Pot's whole system was really very simple. The idea, of course, is to get rid of the past, to start anew. But when he herds people out of the cities and forces them to become farmers and labourers, they haven't got a clue what they're doing. And worst of all is the people that are managing them, they don't have a clue either. They were just soldiers who were Pol Pot's mates, and now they've been elevated into a higher position. They haven't got a clue what's going on. So when everything starts to fail, then places like S21 come into full effect. Because there's one thing any dictator cannot stand, and that is the blame. It can never be his fault or his ideas. It has to be someone else. There has to be a perceived enemy, because it is that invisible enemy that is causing the utopia not to be built. This is something we see very much in cults. There's always a perceived enemy if you're inside a cult. And their enemy was numerous. It was usually the CIA, or, Western influence, or those dastardly Vietnamese are up to something. So it is quite incredible to say that every single person that died, over 2 million people, every single one was innocent. That's how crazy his regime was. It was his hatred of the Vietnamese that was to be his downfall. I mean, earlier he had issued a dictate saying that every single Cambodian should kill at least 30 Vietnamese. And as such, he just couldn't get them out of his head. He seemed to be a bit obsessed with them, for he was ever sending troops over the border, harrying them and starting small skirmishes. Well, after a while, the Vietnamese got fed up with this, and rightly so. So they gathered up their troops, 150,000 men, all of them trained, all of them well armed, and they swept across the border into Cambodia like some giant wave. The Khmer Rouge weren't nearly as well trained or supplied, and the Vietnamese army pushed and pushed and pushed them back until they took the capital of Phnom Penh. But that wasn't the end of Pol Pot, because he retreated to the mountains here at An Long Ven, where I am at this very moment. And it wasn't until 20 years later there was some sort of trial.
And it was here that Pol Pot's trial was held. Less of a courthouse, more of a village hall. He sat on a solitary stool, surrounded by people who were once his followers. So it was here, in An Long Ven, in the north of Cambodia, that a crowd gathered to see the final chapter. Military personnel also attended, but at the head was the local chieftain, and it was he that read out the convictions against Pol Pot and how he had betrayed the party. The people looked on impassively because they had seen all of this before. It may well have been a very similar person that stood behind a table and railed for the Khmer Rouge rather than against it. And every time a conviction was read out against Pol Pot, the audience was encouraged. They raised their fists and chanted, "Crush, crush, crush." These must have been the exact same words that were used repeatedly to slaughter millions of people who were perceived to be against the Khmer Rouge. But this time it was different. Pol Pot sat alone as the echo of "crush, crush, crush" was railed against him this time.
What happened to Pol Pot after that pseudo trial? Because it wasn't so much a criminal conviction as a dethroning. because all he lost really was his political power. Well, he lived up here, up on this mountain, and what you see behind you is one of the many guard huts that lined this road, because his bunker was up there. And he lived in this area with his family, and he lived quite comfortably. But that doesn't mean he rested easy, because up on this mountain here, you can see out through Cambodia, and he knew full well that the government forces were coming for him, and they had some very tough questions. Now, what would be absolutely fantastic is if we could go back in time and ask him those two critical questions. The first being, why did this all happen? And secondly, do you feel any shame and guilt? Well, guess what? Many years ago, one intrepid reporter travelled this very path, and he asked those very questions.
ខ្ញុំសូមជម្រាបខ្ញុំធ្វើការងារខាងលើមានតែខ្ញុំសម្រេចតែចំពោះអ្នកសំខាន់ទេហើយអ្នកសង្គមខ្ញុំមិនដឹងទេមនុស្សនេះចូលមកក្នុងបកចូលមកក្នុងដឹកនាំកម្ពុជាជាតិតៃគឺមិនមែនជាមនុស្សកម្ពុជាជាតិតៃទេហើយរឿងដែលខ្ញុំជម្រាបនៅពេលនេះគឺថាពី76 77មានចាត់តាំងពួកអានឹងក្រុមនោះគេចាត់តាំងគណៈកម្មាធិការធ្វើរដ្ឋប្រហារអ្នកដឹកនាំកម្ពុជាជាតិតៃពិសេសគឺសម្រាប់ខ្ញុំពួកនេះគឺថាមានមនុស្សពួកយួននេះគេថាខ្ញុំមិនចាំអត់ទេប៉ុន្តែតាមមកតែចូលគណៈកម្មការដែលខ្ញុំបានឯកសារណាគណៈកម្មការធ្វើរដ្ឋប្រហារមានយ៉ានេះជាមនុស្សដ៏យួនតាំងពីឆ្នាំ1946ខ្ញុំរួមតស៊ូមិនមែនដើម្បីសម្រាប់ប្រជាជនសម្រាប់ជាតិទេឥឡូវក៏ដោយលោកមើលខ្ញុំជាមនុស្សកាចសាហាវគឺឃើញឬក៏យ៉ាងម៉េចអត់ទេដូច្នេះជាសតិសម្បជញ្ញៈជាទិសដៅអត់មានបញ្ហានេះទេបែរចែកឲ្យច្បាស់ទៅពី3ដងចង់ដាច់ខ្យល់ដូចឈ្មោះលោកពិតនឹងនៅតែលោកថាខ្ញុំបញ្ចប់ហើយខ្ញុំយល់ថាខ្ញុំចប់ទាំងនយោបាយខ្ញុំចប់ទាំងអាយុជីវិតណាបញ្ហានេះច្បាស់តែឈ្មោះឥឡូវនេះខ្ញុំស្លាប់ទៅនេះមានបំណងថាធ្វើម៉េចឲ្យកម្ពុជានៅជាកម្ពុជាក្រមនៅជាកម្ពុជាបច្ចុប្បន្នហើយនៅខាងលិច
Well, that was absolutely amazing, and I was absolutely staggered because I absolutely hate this man. But I didn't think it was possible to loathe him anymore. But on viewing that, my blood just boiled, because what he's saying is, it's not my fault. You see, the problem was, he says, that he was at the very pinnacle, and therefore he only issued orders to the next strata below him. And he had no real influence whatsoever as to what was happening in the fields. You know, that area where millions of people were being killed. But he has an answer for that, you see. He says the reason all that happened because there were these new guys that came in that said they were Khmer Rouge and they corrupted the system. And then he doubles down by saying they were in with the Vietnamese. So his racism yet again rears its ugly head. Just like Hitler, who was a rabid racist, is, you know, it's not us, it's them. It beggars belief. So how did Pol Pot actually die? What we've just seen is a kind of show trial. I mean, there wasn't any real justice. I mean, all that happened was they just took his power away and said it was all your fault. But that's no justice, is it? I mean, there's 2 million dead in the fields. There's millions more that have suffered and will suffer for the rest of their lives. The final blow was brought by this guy, Tamuk. He's number 2. And to me, it's very strange to be standing here, because it could have been on that actual bench there that Tamuk and Pol Pot sat as they discussed, what are we going to do? The government forces are closing in. Pol Pot said, let's give it up. We'll give up the army and all our arms and we'll negotiate a kind of settlement. But Tamuk looked at him and said, no. I'm not doing that. We're in this all the way. Well, with a disagreement like that, things couldn't go much further, could they? I mean, this is Tamuk's house, and through the jungle there, down the track, is Pol Pot's residence, that bunker with a house next to it. And it was to be the final decisions that were ever to be made within the Khmer Rouge, because what Tamuk said is, Pol Pot, you know, his legs have gone, his nerve has gone, and we can't have him, you know, destroying our utopia, our ideals. So what he did was he sent people to Pol Pot's house and they poisoned him. And this is the final few yards heading towards Pol Pot's secret bunker and his final residence. Right here, we're heading through the walls, going through the gates and heading towards that last location. Now, I have been here numerous times and every time it fascinates me. On the right here is where his house once was, and directly in front of us is that secret bunker. This is a place where not many people come. Not now, and certainly not in the past, because this is Pol Pot's final lair. It's his secret bunker in the jungle up on the mountain. Now, I didn't think I would be able to show you this in this film, because it's the rainy season and the past couple of days it has tipped down. The road in is a jungle track and it turned into a river of mud. I attempted it yesterday and it was horrendous. There's no way I could have passed. But today the sun came out. I gave it another go and there's a knife edge of a road. It's about the width of my back tyre, and crawling along at an incredibly slow pace, I have made it here. And it's very important because it's here that Pol Pot lived out those final days, and it was here he was assassinated. And it's about now I can hear people screaming at their screen saying, no, Mr. B, you're wrong, I've checked on the internet and it says he died of old age. Well, you're right, that's what you'll find on Wikipedia. But guess what? If you come here to An Long Veng and you speak to the locals, you'll be very hard pushed to find one person that agrees with that, because everyone round here says he was killed. He was assassinated by his number 2. And if I'm going to believe anyone, I'm going to believe those people that were in this very tight-knit community. Now, this bunker I have featured, as I say, in a previous video at greater length. So please look in the description, because it is a truly fascinating place. It's not often you get to visit and look round a madman's lair, is it? And this was the one of Pol Pot, of course. Now, he did have a bunker. He had a rat hole, a spider hole, I believe the military call them, and it was under here. This is the original cover, because what we're talking is recent history. Now, the reason this would have been built is for aerial bombardment. They knew he was up in these hills somewhere, but they didn't know where. So let's say military government planes were coming over, then this is the way he would go. And for a bunker, I'll tell you what, it's not badly built, especially one that's deep in the jungle. Now, it is pitch black down here. Well, there's very little light, but fortunately I've got an iPhone and it kind of specializes in low light. So we're very, very fortunate. Now, this room here would have been for stores and I would say munitions, because this room seems so much more likely for me to be where beds would have been. You'd have your bunk beds over here, if you can see my hand, and over to the left. Now, the second stairway here takes you into that building you first saw when we pulled up on the bike. Now, I'm a little bit hesitant because I know that there is something crawling around in here. It's either rats or snakes. So I'm going to Scooby-Doo up here as quickly as I can and get back into the light. But there's no way I'm leaving here without showing you this absolute gem of history. Now here we are, you see, we come back up and this is that building you saw me first emerge from. So that is the hole we've just emerged from. And out here is the hole we went down into. Now, as you can see, it's not a particularly big bunker. Exit there, entrance here, or other way round. And that obviously lets us know that this is more an air raid shelter. It's a place to take cover. It is not a place to hide. And its location is right next to what was actually Pol Pot's house. That building stood here. This is Pol Pot's actual residence, his house. And allow me to very quickly just show you around. Here would have been the front doorway. And what we can denote here is there was a room here and another there. Can you see those distinct lines? Well, this is the larger one. So this would have been the main bedroom. This is where the madman himself laid his head at night. And my guess is this second room up here would have been a radio room. Because when you're that paranoid, you want to be in contact all the time. And this being his bedroom and this way being the front door, right next to the bunker, he's got easy access to get out and get on the run. As he stepped out of his bedroom, here would have been the dining room. There would have been books and a table and so on. I surmise this would have been the radio room and the keeping of files and records. All dictators do have to keep track. And at the back here, we have his toilet and shower. Now, we can actually see remnants of this to endorse this theory, because look down here. This is the base of Pol Pot's toilet. As we come back up, we see the two water tanks that were to feed that toilet, but also the shower, which was here. You see these holes? This is where the shower was mounted. Here, a naked Pol Pot would have come each and every morning to shower and to clean himself. And after his morning progress, it was into the kitchen. And this is rather a large kitchen, isn't it? Now, there is a reason for this, and that is Pol Pot had 4 soldiers here with him. Now, the reason I know that is when I first came here, and believe me, this is a tough find, I was guided in by a member of the military who spoke only a smattering of English, but with us waving hands and pointing, he communicated to me in this sanctorum, this inner sanctum of sanctums, that only 4 guards were allowed. So along here would have been cabinets and food supplies, which would have been brought out to the dining room here. There again is the bedroom, and over there is the bunker where we first emerged from. Now, if we move forward, as Pol Pot would have done, I mean, you know, let's remember this is only recent history, coming out of his doorway here, past his spider hole and so on. We see a very good reason as to why he was positioned here, apart from it's unbelievably difficult to get to and hard to find. I mean, he's way up in the sky here. Look at this. Cambodia just lays itself out in front of you. And the wonderful thing about being up here is if you run a radio mast up into these trees, then you can broadcast for literally mile after mile. You can be in contact with all your troops which are that way, because directly behind me is Thailand. And for the second time on this video, we get to sit exactly where Pol Pot sat and see exactly what he saw. The whole of Cambodia unfurled in front of him. And as I mentioned just then, behind him is Thailand. And coming here, you have to be exceptionally careful, because if you take the wrong track, you will literally end up in Thailand. It's only a matter of feet and meters away. It's not very far at all. But the bigger danger with coming off the path here and taking the wrong track is it could be the final decision you ever made, because this area is very heavily mined. Now, Pol Pot and his ilk never stop amazing me. And yet again, just coming here, a place that hardly anybody ever comes to, we see things that astonish. This is a .50 caliber bullet. It was just literally lying on the ground. It's not one of those small regular sort of bullets you're used to. This will punch a huge hole through armour or take down a plane. And this is a live round. I'm very careful not to drop it. You can tell by its weight. This is certainly not hollow. So even here, there is live munitions littering the ground. So this is where our tyrant hid himself away. And I've just given you a very brief whistle-stop tour. And it's very interesting, isn't it, that death still litters the floor. And it's incredible that the history books quote very clearly that this man died of old age. But as I said before, you ask anyone around here and they will tell you a different story. So, where is he now? And this is where our final chapter lays, because this is the final resting place of Pol Pot, under these few bits of rusted corrugated iron, hemmed in by a fence that's never attended to, because nobody cares about him now. And that's how it should be. You see, his lifeless body was dragged to this piece of wasteland, and he wasn't cremated in the usual ceremonial sort of way. He was just dumped here, and some old bits of rubbish and tyres and so on were heaped onto the body and set ablaze. They couldn't get rid of him fast enough. And one of the wonderful ironies is, brother number one was taken out by his most trusted lieutenant, and that of course was brother number two. And even he was caught in the end and convicted of war crimes and spent his last days in jail. I've lived here in Cambodia for 14 years, and I see on a daily basis the devastation this guy caused. I mean, there's over 10 million bits of ordnance in the ground, you know, stuff like mines. I see an awful lot of people in my travels filming forgotten temples who have limbs missing, even children. So this guy, I sincerely hope, is in hell. As always, I ask you to like, subscribe and comment, and if by chance you could drop a few coins in to help me build up my library of forgotten temples, then I would be truly grateful. The address for that is patreon.com/temples. Until next time, this is Mr. B wishing you absolutely nothing but the very best. You take good care.